anesthetic, when she starts waking up, she's no telling what she might say. Because my granddaughter Amanda had her tonsils removed. She was about that size. And when they brought her back into her mama was holding her, and she's sitting there about half asleep, kind of woke up, groggy, had a half smile on her face and looked at me, and she said, "Papa's older than dirt." Y'all all right? I don't remember. Yeah, that's 22 years ago. It was August the 28th, I know that. And anyway, but you never know what kids are going to say when they wake up out of being drugged. I know where she got it. That daddy of hers. He had said that, not around me, I know. You know, no telling what your family says about each other when you're not around, right? Face it, it happens. Anyway, her daddy taught her a terrible thing like that. Ruth chapter 1, and I'm going to begin in verse 18. I don't know on a Mother's Day or any other day when I preached about Ruth, but I know I have. I don't know what my notes were and what I covered back then, but I know that I probably did. But anyway, I'm going to put a little different slant to it than whatever I did before, because some of the thoughts that I'm going to cover today I know I have not brought up before. But Ruth chapter 1, and Ruth is really an abbreviated part of the book of Judges. The events that happened in the book of Ruth happened during the time of the Judges. And so it's just a story that comes out of the book of Judges. And it could have been just inclusive with the book as such stories as Samson and so on, but it wasn't. It appears as a separate book. All right, well, let's begin reading in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1. Now, it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Benjamin, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, and they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughter-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house, for the Lord dealt kindly with you, as he has dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. And they said unto her, Surely we will return with thee unto thy people. And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. Why will ye go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am old, too old to have an husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have an husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Would ye stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. And she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people, and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and where I be, there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught put death but part thee and me. And when she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, then she left, speaking unto her. Now, you know, part of that's been used in wedding ceremonies for centuries, in part of it. The time period of events that we're talking about is in the time of the judges. Notice in verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled. We know that this happened near the end of the time of the judges. We have the genealogies in Matthew and Luke, and it talks about Boaz and Ruth have a son named Obed, and then he has a son named Jesse, and Jesse has a son named David. David was born during the reign of King Saul. And so we're not going to go the time of the judges ended with King Saul. So we're not going to go very far back in genealogy into the time of the judges. So it happened near the end of the time of the judges in the world. So the time element is very near the end. And I don't really can identify. You know, you can only guess how one was when the other one was born and so on. You go back. But we're going to go back to probably a little bit before Samson, before the story of Samson. Maybe right after the judge Gideon, you know, in his defeating with only 300 men. And so between Gideon and Samson and that time period there, near the end of having judges in Israel is when this particular account took place. Now, we learn something about that time period in which Elimelech and Naomi lived during the time of the judges. But verse 1, the latter part of it says, And there was a famine in the land. Judges chapter 17, verse 6 says, In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And then in Judges 21, it makes that same statement again. So during the time of the reign of the judges, there was no one particular ruler or nor any king over Israel, and that time period was about 300 years. And so what would happen, the people of Israel, they would get lax. They would do like our Sunday school lesson talked about today. They would forget about God. They would forget about where they come from. They would forget about all the bounty and the blessings that they had received. And so they would drift away from God. They would start mingling into this idolatry, and they're doing things disobedient. And so God would allow the enemies to come against them and disturb them, plague them, cause them harm and trouble, and the Israelites would cry out to God, God, send of us to deliver. These Philistines are driving us crazy. And so God would raise up a man, a judge, and women too. And God would raise up somebody from among the people who would step up to be a leader and take charge, and he would drive out the enemies and bring peace to the people of Israel once again. Well, something's going on, and we don't know the details of it, but there was a famine in the land. Famines just didn't happen to Israel. They didn't happen by accident. They happened because the people of Israel had began forsaking the Lord. Now I want to mark this down. We can be hard on our government leaders all we want to, and they deserve everything they get, okay? I'm not going to get political. But what I'm telling you is the country is not going in the direction that it is because of a handful of leaders in Washington, D.C. This whole country, people-wise, is in trouble, okay? And God's just using them to try to get the attention of the American people, the American public, to get their attention. And so I just want to remind you of that just a little bit, because it is not, in my mind, I am not so concerned about what a handful of leaders are doing, because they can't do anything the people don't let them do, and it's because of the people of our country has gotten away from God. Because our church buildings are empty and people are busier than ever out there, but they don't have time for God. And if you don't have time for God, God won't have time for you. So this was it, the people had drifted away. There was a famine in the land, and God was bringing His judgment upon the people to get them to repent of their sins and turn back to Him. So God was punishing the nation of Israel by causing that famine in the land. And now the second point I want to emphasize is that Elimelech and Naomi were part of the problem. Let me show you why. They were part of the problem. Latter part of verse 1, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons, and the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. Instead of staying in the land where they belonged, Elimelech decided to move his family down southeast into the country of the Moabites. Pagans, idolaters, of every sin and crime. They moved out of the land God promised to give them to inhabit, and He took His family down here out of the land to where the pagans were. Now, things were bad enough in the land, but you were better staying in the land with a famine than taking your family to live among the pagans. That was a greater sin, taking your family out of the land of Canaan. Even there was. What you should have done is stayed in the land and called upon the Lord for help. Let the Lord do the providing and let the Lord be the help. But instead, they decided to move down to Moab, where there was much evil and their pagan gods. They should have remained in the land. So they had 2 sins. First of all, they had the sin of not putting their trust and their faith in God. If there's anything today that parents need to do, is teach their children to have faith in God. Secondly, they didn't have much concern about living among the pagans and raising their sons in a pagan environment. And so that was a crime on their part, and it appears they weren't even concerned about the sons marrying pagan wives down there in the Moabites. All right, now the third thing we learn from this is that we cannot prosper when we know we are doing what is not right. When we know that whatever we're doing is not right with God, and God doesn't approve of it, we cannot prosper. We cannot expect God's blessings when we know we're doing what's right. But preacher, we have to go where the work is. I have to go and take care of my family. Well, it doesn't matter if you're taking your family away from God. It doesn't matter if you're taking them among the pagans. But preacher, Sunday is my only day off. I have to work 6 days a week, and that's my only day off. So? That's about true with the rest of you? And that's what that day off is for. If your lifestyle is in conflict with what you know is right, then don't expect God to bless. If you're doing what God disapproves of and you know it, you're not going to have God's blessings, and neither do you have the right to complain if God doesn't bless and things go wrong. Verse 3, and Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. It said, and she was left and her 2 sons. Naomi, it's time to go home. When her husband died and she had the 2 sons, wouldn't that be the time to go home, take your sons back home, and get them out of that place and get back to where your family was? But she didn't. And verse 4 says, and they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. Then we come to verse 5, that Mahlon and Chilion died also. It said both of them. Now, Naomi is down there by herself. And so she's lost her family. They sold the farm, and she didn't have anything left. And so she had no real ability outside of repentance of asking God to help her in the situation that she's in. You know, people get in those situations. They don't have time for God. They disregard God. God, don't bother me. I hadn't got time for you. And if something goes wrong, well, it's God's fault. God could have done something about this. He could have prevented this. So people that don't want God will blame God if things don't go well. Now that she's lost everything, Naomi decides to go home. She lost her husband. She lost her sons. She's lost her family. She has nothing left, and she goes back to Israel. Now, when she gets back to Israel, her poverty level is indicated by the fact that she lives off of the gleanings off of the fields. You know, back in Israel's day, they didn't have a welfare program like we have today, where we give everybody a card and put money on it and they go get whatever they want. Back in those days, you had to work for it. Even though they gave it, they had a program. They had a program to help the poor. Sometimes the poor needs help, and they had a program for it. And so when there was a farm, let's say wheat harvest is coming in, the corners of the farm could not be harvested. And sometimes the owners would leave rows of wheat just so that the poor could come out and gather it and gather what they needed and maybe even supply their home for a long time. And so the fact that she was benefiting from the gleanings of the field indicated that her lifestyle was in that of poverty. And so, but even then, Naomi was still the most spiritual person in the family, wasn't she? She was still had more spirituality than anybody else. So in her yearning to go back home, she spoke to her daughters-in-law about Israel. And probably when things got very difficult, she talked about how God had delivered Israel. And she spoke of the Lord. And having spoken with the Lord, she got the attention. And verse 6, then she arose and her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. And so she started talking about Israel, and now that they're being blessed back in the land, she desired to go back to her home. So that after she had lost everything. Now, here's the one I want to focus on, And that is sometimes the most unlikely people will turn to the Lord. Now, there's some good in the story, isn't it? They made a lot of mistakes. She lost her family, but she also was the cause of one person coming to know the Lord that otherwise would not have come to the Lord. Ruth prepared to go to the land of Israel, and then we noticed in verse 9, and she said to her daughters-in-law that the Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. And so she tried to part her ways. And then all the way down in verse 15, Ruth wanted to stay with her, and she said, behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people, and unto her gods return thou after thy sister-in-law. Now, she wasn't exactly the best spiritual leader to her daughter-in-law because she encouraged her to go back to her people and to her gods. That should have been left out of the advice, not to go back to her gods. And so, but nonetheless, somebody raised up in a pagan environment without any real major godly influence can be saved if it is the desire in their heart to be right with God. Now, it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful for kids to be raised up in homes, Christian homes. A matter of fact, if kids are raised up in a home with the mom, with a single mom, the chances of those kids knowing the Lord's about is much greater than it is with unsaved parents. But if a kid is raised up in the home with a father that loves the Lord, the probability of that kid being saved is higher than all the other put together. It's great. Now, I was not raised up in a home that was a Christian home. We didn't even have a Bible in our house, and I don't. It probably would have been thrown out if it had been. I was not raised in a Christian home, but I found God. Ruth found the Lord, and so if you desire, have that desire to be right with God, God will open the paths. He'll provide the way that you can find Him if you're looking for Him. If you're not looking for Him now, you won't find Him. But if you're looking for Him, of all people, really think about this. Ruth is really the hero in the story because she had the same choice that her sister did, but she refused to go back to her family and her gods to go to Israel where the God of Israel was. Well, Ruth was the most spiritual, so she married a man by the name of Boaz. And she and Boaz had a son named Obed. And he had, I don't know who he married, but he had a son named Jesse. And Jesse had a son named David. And Ruth, the pagan woman from Moab, became a Christian, married a man, and she's in the lineage of Jesus. Now, what an honor for somebody. If you want to find God, you can find Him. He is not far from everybody that seeks after Him. And God is there if you want Him. It's your choice. It's your decision of just how much of God do you want in your life and what kind of influence you want to have on others. It'll have an invitation. So if you're in your relationship